So we are on, Sonia and Juan Carlos, and of course, I invite all our guests to make your questions through the chat. We can do that. We have about, I don't know, Juan Carlos, half an hour, 45 minutes?
I think Jose Miguel would know.
Jose Miguel, I'm sorry.
Yeah, I mean, we have until 12:30.
Okay, hour and a half.
Hour and a half, 1 hour.
Very good, very good. Let me ask with a question. Let me start with a question for Sonia regarding the title. I have my own interpretation, but I would like to hear yours. Why the vertical border? Because borders are, especially this one, horizontal.
Yes, thank you, Alejandro. Well, first of all, thank you for this opportunity to be here to present this film and have this conversation with all of you and also with the audience. The vertical border, we decided on this title precisely because we wanted to offer this film as a way of rethinking migration, but also the nature and the purposes of borders. So, of course, we tend to think of borders as horizontal structures, very often perhaps simple lines, but when we actually get closer to borders, we see that they're quite different, that they're actually more extensive, that they're really border zones. This is a term that is quite often used at the US-Mexico border, for example. And of course, as one might see also in Central America, especially when we talk about gang-controlled neighborhoods, there are also different kinds of borders, and they're known as invisible borders. So these are just some examples. But why did we want to talk about a vertical border? This is because really what we see stretching from the United States south, not only through Mexico, but also to Central America and even further south, even reaching into South America. So the film focuses on what happens to migrants from northern Central America, and so the focus is on Mexico, but we might also say that this is really a global issue, not just the displacement, but also the border constructs that we wanted to show here. So we can think about borders in very different ways, but in the case of Mexico, we wanted to talk about the vertical border, not just because migrants face obstacles when they actually try to cross different borders between the countries, trying to get out of Mexico, trying to get into Mexico, out of Central America into Mexico and into the United States, but also the obstacles that really exist along what we call this vertical border. So with this idea of the vertical border, we wanted to draw attention what is happening to migrants, not just in terms of migration controls, because this vertical border is really an instrument of deterrence, a way of keeping unwanted migrants out of Mexico, but especially out of the United States. But it was also a way for us to show that this migration deterrence goes beyond the formal migration apparatus that perhaps we tend to think about. So Mexico is an interesting example because much more is happening to migrants, not just formal migration controls. We saw images of immigration agents, also members of the armed forces, the National Guard, who have become much more involved in migration control. But we were also trying to show that migrants have become caught up in what is called the drug war in Mexico. So of course, the drug war itself was not launched as a strategy against migrants, but the violence that exists in Mexico has this additional deterrent effect on migrants. So if we want to compare the discomfort and the the experiences that irregular migrants have in the United States. Something that has often been commented in the US context is when people are in detention centers and they experience very cold conditions, yeah, like the ice box. So this is just another example of what states are doing to make the migration experience very unpleasant for migrants, so unpleasant that people will remember it, and when they're being deported, that they will not try to repeat this journey. Yeah, and this deterrent effect, of course, also is meant for other migrants who have not yet attempted this journey. So if we go back to Mexico, the drug war also has this effect simply because migrants transit different parts of Mexico in order to reach the border with the United States. And by doing so, they also transit territories that are controlled by criminal groups who fight among each other, but who also have a conflict with the Mexican state. So this is really the idea of the vertical border. This film does not just want to perhaps to shape our perspectives on migration, to tell a story about why people need to abandon their homes, but also especially to show how states react to those forced migrants.
Very nice. Yes, my interpretation perhaps is a little more philosophical, in the sense that verticality is blind. When you see ways, when you see problems or issues in a vertical manner, you only see it one way, and clearly this, and you don't see things. So for me, it's one of the messages of your film is that immigrants are invisible, non-existent, and that comes with verticality. When you see things horizontally, it's meaning in a democratic way, you have different perspectives, and you can understand a problem from a 360 grades angle, and the other option is only to see it vertically. But I would like to have the point of view of Juan Carlos Gómez. What do you think first of the film, Juan Carlos?
I think that there was one great contribution that I truly appreciated in the film, and that is that you gave a face and a voice to so many kind and amazing people at shelters and who advocate for not just individuals, but for sort of groups of individuals in a sort of a no-win situation, whether it's the shelter that helps the people from the monster, the train, or the on the border, understanding the different populations, the complexity. You put a face on it so that other individuals who normally would not be out there, who would not be acknowledged, the Doctors Without Borders, that they're out there in the group that's out there in the field. And the fact that you also, there was something you did that reminded me of a constant problem that we have, not just in these three countries, but that we experience with many people from almost every single country, and that people forget history. I remember having a conversation with a young guerrilla fighter who was here in the US seeking asylum. We were actually on a Saturday night having a conversation at a bingo hall in a Catholic church where he was seeking legal services. And one of the things that he said was that he left because he got tired of poor on poor crime in what he said he didn't understand. The sons and daughters of the negotiators and of the leaders of his movement, and the sons and daughters and the leaders of the government side were living in these wonderful lives, while he was starving, hitting people up for food in the middle of the night with an AK-47, and it reminded me of, my goodness, that history, he remembers it. He must be 30 some years older now. And one of the tragedies that exist is that people have forgotten that there have been wars, the history of persecution. And by showing this film, you keep that alive. And it is so important that we not forget. And it's an extremely important function of this film to show, especially the history of macro repression and the atrocities committed in these countries, understanding that atrocities are committed, of course, throughout the world tragically. But in these countries, one of the things that happens is that here in Miami, we constantly speak to people. On Saturday, we expected about 40 people at a Nicaraguan church. We got over 400 asking for help. And the thing is that it reminded me of the people at the shelters that you filmed and that you allowed them to tell their stories. And the answer is, how? How are we going to help these people? Because unless you shed light on this situation as you've done, then the story dies, and they're just more mass numbers reported in some government statistical report in the bureaucracy, and people forget. One of the greatest tragedies that I see is how immigrants actually easily take on the position of closing the door behind them, and they forget that they themselves had a privilege that was hard fought for. I think of Salvadorans and Guatemalans during the American Baptist Church settlement and the opportunity, a second chance to get a work permit to survive. During the war, years later, a chance to get residency. And one of the frustrations that those of us in the field experience is, my goodness, there are so many of these situations that could be avoided today. So many people who could have petitioned for their loved ones, but they didn't. Who could have used the tradition, the limited legal system that exists. They could have done it, and it didn't happen. And the thing is, though, that only by you raising consciousness and you showing the problems that people face, the horrors that they experience along their journey, I think it's important that it's an important film. Understanding that the border itself. One of the things that I thought about the title, when you said a vertical border, I interpreted it differently, because in the Trump administration, there was always this idea that he didn't really need to build physical walls because they had built a bureaucratic wall, and that the bureaucratic wall was so unsurmountable that you go ahead. If you make it here, we're going to make your life. And to this day, there is an anti-immigrant movement that makes life almost illegal. You can't drive, you can't work. You basically are tied down by state level laws, by federal laws that in many ways are just tools of the anti-immigration movement. And so that's when you said, when I read your title, I was like, oh, okay, that's what was meant. I'll be quiet since maybe you might want to say something.
Do you have any comment, Sonia?
Yeah, thank you. Perhaps just to respond to your last comment, I think certainly there are many concepts, many different ways of thinking about what happens to migrants, and actually Todd Miller, when he talked about what is happening at the US-Mexico border, he also explained the smart border, which is something that the Biden administration has really promoted. So there are certainly lots of things going on. But when you mentioned the bureaucratic wall, this is very relevant also in Mexico. And I don't want to sound too general and not to subsume all these different things that are happening under this term, the vertical border. Yeah, but I think if we, I mean, it is also related to really to the shape of the Mexican territory, because simply this is how we can see Mexico on an actual map. So it makes sense to talk about this border that really extends through the Mexican territory. But I would not want people to again to think of the vertical border simply as one simple line that is extending through Mexico, but this is a border that is also branching out into different parts of Mexico. So the bureaucratic wall also is part of this vertical border that exists in Mexico, because what we've seen over almost a decade is that as people have realized that it's become harder to enter the United States because of the dangers and also the costs that is associated with the border crossings, more people have turned to asylum applications. Yeah, and so this is another difficulty that we see now in Mexico, because the agency that we also showed in the film, the COMA, is really overwhelmed with asylum applications, and it's interesting also to follow this a little in social media, because the head of the agency who we interviewed for the film, he often speaks of this sharp increase in asylum applications, but this is only part of the story. So of course the number of asylum applications in Mexico has increased as people have found it more difficult to get into the United States, but the other part of the story really has to do with the nature of the asylum system in Mexico. And so we could compare this to other countries. I'm from Germany, and in my own country, there is a more robust asylum system. So people can apply for asylum, and throughout this process, there will be housing and there will be other supports for the applicants. But this is not something that exists in Mexico. So what Juan Carlos called the bureaucratic wall, this is really being replicated in Mexico, because people, most certainly migrants who enter from Central America, tend to be in one state, Chiapas. We showed what is happening in Tapachula, and so this is where really migrants are concentrated, and where the sense of despair among migrants is really palpable. And there have been hunger strikes and more dramatic actions that are being taken now by migrants, because people are so desperate to find a solution to their problems. But what happens, they can apply for asylum, but then they don't know how long this process is going to take, and because the number of asylum applications has increased so much, this process is now taking much longer than it should take. Not 6 weeks, but several months, even a year is quite common. And during this time, people don't have supports. They are left to their own devices, having to find housing and jobs, and just generally also struggle to access healthcare. So this is, I think, when you mentioned the bureaucratic wall, it's also important to bring this up in the Mexican context, because what we see really on the part of the United States and also Mexico is really on the one hand, this rhetorical emphasis on human rights, that migrants are being rescued from unscrupulous smugglers who try to bring them to the United States. And so there's, in practice, on the other hand, this emphasis on intercepting migrants, on detaining and deporting them, but there's really very little that we see in terms of really giving people the assistance and the protection that forced migrants need. So all we see is really this emphasis on border security and keeping out migrants. But if the United States does not want to give sanctuary to these migrants, even though I don't see any good argument for doing so, the United States is supporting the migration apparatus of Mexico, but it does very little to support this other part, to dismantle this bureaucratic wall that migrants are struggling with in Mexico.
But there is the other side, though, which is a problem. We have a joke in my field, which is that the U.S. government should hire the cartels and the coyotes to do their messaging. Because no matter what lawyer tells you, you could have the most reasonable lawyer, and the person will just smile and go and pay the smuggler and risk their lives, understanding that that you pay to get through different territories, but then also the smugglers also sometimes, as was mentioned by, I believe, the father, the priest, he mentioned the idea of when people are then extorted. And one of the interesting things is that you're running the risk of violence, sexual violence, of extortion. And then the family members freak out over here. And they go, oh, wait, this is not, we had a business deal, as if it was like I bought a car from you and we had a contract. And the answer is no, the smuggler really is not, there's no legitimate law in the eye of the smuggler. And for many years now, one of the problems that happened is that, or has happened, and is continuing to happen, you have also other groups that, for example, there are a couple of, not a couple, but many problems. One is children have become the key to the door in a way, so that the message is because of the Wilberforce Act, which was meant to protect children, or because of the Flores settlement, there's this message that bring a child, so that smugglers actually will have the mother with one child and the father with another, and in some instances, the rental of children as needed, which is supposedly going to get you out of custody faster. People tell you what they think you want to hear to succeed in their claim. And so the thing is, though, that one of the problems that happens is that the legitimacy of legal systems in different countries, it's a big problem, because the person's agenda, the person's goal is different than the bureaucrats, than the lawyer, than the immigration judge or asylum officer, than the politicians in different countries. And it's an interesting, complex situation. But one of the problems is that this is not what asylum was about. And the problem is that we neither address the causes. One of the issues, I blame diasporas from every single immigrant producing country, because the thing is, though, that in part, how much reinvestment, you have remittances to support family, but how much development is actually taking place in the different towns, in the different villages, to help populations. I am so tired of domestic violence cases, because my goodness, how much more do we have to sort of tell people this is a problem in the governments of these countries, but then also people. My favorite group here in Miami is a group of undocumented people against undocumented people, because they're against irregular immigration, but they belong to a fundamentalist church that supports the Trumpist movement. And it's so cute to talk to them, and you go, but didn't you break the law? And they go, no, we're different. And so people choose to apply the law favorably to those they love. And it's not just the people from the Northern Cone. You have Cubans, you have Haitians, you have Venezuelans, you have this mass number. Right now, one of the problems at the southern border is that there's a Mariel going on through the southern border. In Mariel boat lift from 1980, basically, you have neighborhoods emptying out on this island in Cuba. And so the question is, you have this mix of issues that the question is, how do we educate people and provide the resources to people so that we can have no need to do this? And there are many foundations that are really well-intentioned and people who have tried really hard to, it's basically called sort of not one more generation having to break up a family. One of the things we saw in the surge from 2012 on, or 2010 if you want, was that mothers and fathers who had become banks instead of mothers and fathers, when the children got here, you saw the reconstruction of a family, and there was a tension that existed, and it was tragic in some instances, because the thing was, wait, my grandmother is my mother. You just sent money, and here you and the mom or the dad here would work 6.5 days a week to barely survive, to live in a house with various other families. And there was a fantasy of it in one of the songs that you had in the background of like what they promise you. And the answer is the reality of, oh my God, what do you mean I have to work as hard as I do to barely survive, to be exploited, to not necessarily be paid a fair wage, to live in a house that's not what I imagined you would live in. And so all of these complexities, I think also impact the border in the sense of your next documentary is the miracle of solving this problem.
And that was precisely what I was thinking. There's another documentary, the sequel, to explain the immigration crisis or issue from the diaspora perspective, and the conflicted views that the diaspora has, because there are some that support immigrants and others that reject them. So that's an interesting topic and something to think about, Sonia.
Thank you.
You're super busy, I know. This is a question from Jose Miguel, and he says, you have been studying this issue for some time now. In the film, what impacted you the most, and how is that portrayed in the film?
Thank you. Perhaps for those who are not familiar with my work, so I have been working on migration for some time. That is true. But I started out with the gangs in Central America, especially in El Salvador. And looking at, especially at gang policies, eventually also led me to look at why people are leaving Central America. And since I'm based in Mexico, of course, I had to look at migration and what happens to migrants in Mexico. But to respond to Miguel's question, I think I have to say what is impacting for us is perhaps not so much what is portrayed in the film, but what we didn't include, or what was difficult to film. So of course we were trying to incorporate different elements, not just as was touched on at the beginning, the historical part of the violence, but also the migration that we're seeing nowadays. But also we wanted initially to explain why is there forced migration? Why should we talk about this displacement in terms of forced migration, not economic migration, perhaps? And then we wanted to talk about this migration deterrence, but there were some challenges involved in doing that in Central America, but also in Mexico. And perhaps what is difficult in that sense is knowing what is happening to people in Central America, especially to people who live in gang-controlled neighborhoods, but also in the case of Honduras, for example, where the poverty and the corruption really affect people and make life very hard for them, and also knowing what then happens to people who have already experienced so much suffering, and then knowing what is happening to them in Mexico. So the violence is very much a part of people's life. But now, why is this perhaps a difficulty for filmmakers? Precisely because we wanted to tell the story, but we also had to be mindful of the protection needs of people. We couldn't jeopardize people's security, not in Central America and not in Mexico. And this is why we relied more on interviews with observers and analysts and practitioners, people working in the shelters, and people like Oscar Martinez. He has even done this whole journey, including riding the beast through Mexico. So we wanted to speak to all these individuals as a way of driving this narrative forward. And of course, it would have been interesting to show more images of gang-controlled neighborhoods in Central America, for example, and also to show perhaps more directly of what is happening to migrants in Mexico, but also what we did include, thanks to the collaboration of journalists who happen to witness certain experiences, is precisely how migrants are being hunted down in Mexico. So this violence, that this repression that comes from the Mexican state, when migration agents, but also members of the National Guard, really run after, chase migrants and assault them. So we were not able to show that much of what is happening. Also, acts of corruption would be very difficult to film, but we wanted to give really an overview of the migration experience, and I think through the various interviews we managed to puzzle the story together. Yeah, but so to respond to Miguel's question, I think what causes an impact on those of us who study this and who would like to tell the story is knowing what is happening, struggling with this difficulty of finding a compelling but also an aesthetically interesting way of telling the story, but also grappling with the knowledge that we know what is happening. So this is really we're telling the story in a different way, but really what's happening in Central America and in Mexico, and also the reaction by the United States, this has been documented already. But really, what is difficult to accept is that all this evidence has not changed the policies, and so this is really ultimately what led us to make this documentary, because we wanted to bring this information to people in a different way.
Right, and that you did pretty well in synthesizing a very complex issue in an hour and 15 minutes or an hour and 10 minutes, where we get different versions and perspectives for the problem. So I would like to continue for a few minutes on your editorial decisions.
May I ask Sonja a question also related to what she was saying?
Yes, of course, Juan Carlos.
Sonja, when the people you were able to let them present from the perspective of the shelter, they spoke in a way for those who you couldn't show because you would endanger them. Whether it was the shelter that had the different modules for the different populations, the LGBT, the assorted other modules. How is this the vehicle you chose to give those populations voice? Because you, for example, you were able to show that African Central American populations that populations that are almost sort of ignored as if they did not exist in Central America or Mexico, and you put them on the screen. And I imagine you did this consciously?
Yes, we thought about what to include and what to exclude. Again, this is another difficult decision, because obviously the migration experience and also the migrant population is more complex, and so we weren't able to discuss all the different experiences. You just mentioned the LGBTQ population, also the experiences of women are touched on more superficially, yeah. But it would have, if we had tried to cover all these different experiences, the documentary would have been much longer, and it wasn't meant to be an academic work, even though the film is based or draws inspiration from the academic research we did previously. But we really the first cut we had was longer, but we had to leave out certain material in order to tell a coherent story, and to perhaps to make to give a more simple message for people who perhaps are not very familiar yet with different concepts and with the argument that we were trying to make. Also, what happened, we had planned this film, and we knew what population and what scenes we were interested in, what we wanted to film, and then of course this whole process takes a while, and not just the planning, the development stage, but also the filming, and of course then afterwards the editing also takes a while. And so what happened during the filming, we had decided from the beginning that we were going to focus on Central Americans. Central Americans have long been an important part of the migrant population in Mexico, and the whole irregular migration movement that is headed towards the United States. But of course, this is only one example. We could have focused on Haitian migrants or on African migrants, and of course there are also other migrants who don't even stay at the shelters, who travel with the smugglers, and who are less visible to those of us who try to study migration movements. And so the pictures that perhaps seem a little out of context when we see Haitian migrants, the Haitian migrants who walk through the streets of Tapachula. We also could have shown them in Tijuana. This is really because the circumstances changed as the filming was already underway. So we had limitations in terms of time and budget. If we had more time, if we'd had more time and more resources, we could have spent more time in certain locations and do more filming of Haitian migrants, for example. Yeah. So, but what we did at the end was really a compromise. We wanted to focus on the Central Americans, to tell a clear story about what is happening in Central American countries as opposed to Haiti or perhaps other countries, even though the drivers of forced migration are similar, but different countries have their own histories and different current circumstances. So it would have been difficult to do justice to these different contexts. And so this is what we see is really a compromise between the story that we wanted to tell, in a compact manner. We also wanted to acknowledge that, of course, Central Americans are not the only forced migrants who head to the United States. Really, this population is more diverse, and it just so happened as the filming was underway that there were Haitian migrant caravans, but we didn't want to stray too much from our original focus, so we decided to include some images, but not to do more interviews or to cover also the situation in Haiti, for example. So this is it's one story, but of course it's possible also to tell other stories about forced migration and migration deterrence.
You know that scene where you had, I'm sorry,
Yeah, that's fine, that's fine, Juan Carlos.
you know that scene where that young woman, she's discussing how it's more dangerous to be a woman on the train. Her voice in those few words that you got on film said so much, because in that short little line, it showed the dangers of being a woman in on this journey, and how much, I mean, vulnerable uh, women are, how much more vulnerable young women are. And just that little clip, it was amazing to listen to her voice, because the tone of her voice alone, what you caught, said it all.
Yeah.
I mean, it was amazing. I don't know if you remember, Alejandro.
Absolutely, and not only that, but the mothers of immigrants that are lost in migration or that are victims of human trafficking. These Honduran women that have organized through the years, looking and infiltrating these organizations, becoming prostitutes, looking for their son or looking for their daughters. Their testimonies are amazing, and I saw the faces of these women and the suffering of these women, and how governments and authorities are not sensitive to their feelings. When you are poor in Latin America, in Central America, in Mexico, and when you are poor and you are of indigenous descent, you basically don't exist. So your feelings don't exist. And if they would have only put their place in their side when you lose a son, a daughter, a granddaughter, things and policies change forever. And I think that the documentary does that very, very well in portraying the sentiments and the drama of these families. I would like to ask a question to Sonja, more related to editorial decisions. In the case of El Salvador and Honduras, you interviewed 2 journalists, but you didn't interview any authority. And in the case of Mexico, obviously the number of interviews included some authorities from Comar, none from the Secretaría de Gobernación. My question was it challenging to interview authorities in these 2 countries, Honduras and El Salvador, and why?
We try to include different perspectives. Of course, we had a particular story we wanted to tell, an argument we wanted to make. So the question about editorial decisions is also relevant in that sense, because even though we had a clear focus for all the interviews, the public officials you see in the film, and those who ultimately did not agree to be interviewed for the film, they are of course interested in sharing their own view, and they do not necessarily agree with the argument that we're making in this film. So initially we tried to branch out more than what would have been really feasible for the film. As I said before, we had really lots of material by the time we concluded the filming, and we had to be quite rigorous in cutting the material, and so some of the interviews were very extensive, and really you can only hear a few fragments really in the interviews. But it was necessary to do this in order to tell a coherent story, and to be able to move up the vertical border and reach the US-Mexico border in not more than 90 minutes. That was really the limit we had established from the outset. So in terms of people we tried to speak to, yes, we reached out to many more individuals than you see in the film. We wanted to speak to authorities also in Central America, but we did not we were not able to obtain collaboration from authorities in Central America. And at the end, we decided to have Oscar Martinez and Ismael Moreno, who are very lucid analysts and who are very familiar not just with the situation in their own countries, of course, but also with the challenges that migrants are facing once they leave their own countries. So that was our way of summarizing really what is happening in Central America. But again, in terms of authorities, and I think what we the difficulties we had in obtaining certain interviews just goes to show how complicated the situation is in Central America and in Mexico, and how sensitive also it is for certain interviewees to speak about the situation, also about what the institutions are doing, and so this was well complicated in Honduras, but also actually in El Salvador. With the current government, it's been very difficult to get information or to get interviews. Really, that's just generally very difficult to access information, let alone do filming in this context. And so in Mexico, the Comar is there, and one might wonder, well, if the head of the asylum agency can speak, why do we not see the commissioner of the National Migration Institute? Why do we see no one from the Secretaría de Gobernación, the Interior Ministry? That's a valid question. We did reach out to the National Migration Institute in Mexico, and we tried until the last moment to get an interview from the commissioner. But that was not possible, unfortunately. So even with the National Human Rights Commission, we had to be persistent to get the interview. The CIDE also does not give interviews easily, but unfortunately the National Migration Institute was more complicated, and we tried two things. One was the interview with the commissioner, which we did not obtain, and another attempt that we made relates to the detention centers, because you will see in the context of Tapachula that we wanted to talk about migrant detention. There is the largest migrant detention center is in Tapachula. This is also where people get deported back to Central America, but and these centers are administered by the National Migration Institute. But for the documentary, again, we were not able to get permission to film or even to get into these installations, just to talk to people without any filming. So the added difficulty in that case was that the detention centers in Mexico are designated national security installations. So it's just generally very difficult for human rights defenders, for journalists, for researchers to get into these installations. You need prior permission by the National Migration Institute, and often these permissions are being denied. But in our case, it also meant that we would have liked to use the drone. You can see drone images in the documentary, and we would have liked to use the drone also, at least to show this detention center in Tapachula from the outside, because this is how we can really appreciate that these are prisons where people are being detained, where people cannot leave on their own accord. But this is not possible either. So the law also prevents you from filming or taking images of any kind of the exterior of these installations. But so yes, we did try to include different perspectives, different voices. But at the end, the individuals and the institutions we approached decided, whether or not they wanted to collaborate. And I think those who participated were very eloquent in explaining what is happening in Central America and Mexico, and how US migration and border policies affect Mexico and the Central American countries. But it's not always possible to include the perspective of state institutions, because they have their own way of managing information, of presenting their perspectives. Actually, we had also approached the Border Patrol in the United States, but the problem was similar. They're simply concerned that the information they share will subsequently used in a critical manner, and this is not how institutions like the Border Patrol or the National Migration Institute in Mexico want to come across. They want to have control over the information that's being shared.
Yeah, before I ask a question to Juan Carlos that comes from Jose Miguel. So in the case of Mexico, this is seen or approached from a national security perspective?
Yes, this is a contradiction that is in the migration law at the moment. The law was reformed a few years ago. Actually, until then, Mexico did not have a migration law as such, only a general population law, because Mexico was long seen as a country of emigration, where Mexicans themselves left for the United States, but there was less concern with migrants coming to the United States. Civil society activism by NGOs and also by shelters eventually led to the adoption of a new migration law, and this is the law is considered in advance in Mexico. It's considered an improvement, but there are still certain contradictions, and one of the main contradictions really relates to this discourse about human rights, because the Mexican state wants to be perceived as respecting the rights of migrants. But on the other hand, there's very clearly also the national security perspective. Yeah, and this also relates to the actors who can perform roles in migration control. So officially, it's the National Migration Institute that is in charge of migration controls, but previously, the federal police, for example, could participate also in immigration controls. These are, or they were armed police officers. The federal police has been abolished by the current government, but now there's a National Guard, and this is really a security agency that includes members of the armed forces. So again, we have this problem that the national security perspective really is how migration is being perceived, and this also really opens the door for armed state agents to participate in migration control, and at the same time, this increases also the risks for migrants.
Now, if the National Guard is involved and the military, in a sense, are involved as well, what about the intelligence services?
We don't hear that much about intelligence agency, not the formal state intelligence agency that exists in Mexico. Unfortunately, this is not very transparent, but we know that that this can be subsumed in what is considered security assistance to Mexico. The Merida initiative, for example, that existed as security cooperation between the United States and Mexico includes or has included funding not just for security agencies, for border control, but also for the National Migration Institute. But this kind of assistance generally is not very transparent, so it's difficult to tell where the money exactly goes. But I wouldn't say that the problem is only with the involvement or not of the state intelligence agency, because the armed forces themselves also can carry out their own intelligence activities.
Right. The next question is for Juan Carlos. The vertical border seems to be taller for some refugees than others. One reason is obviously politics and foreign policy. What would be other reasons? Does the migration bureaucratic apparatus establish its priorities independent of domestic policies?
Well, actually, can I answer or make a couple of quick points on something? You mentioned the hieleras. One of the things in the U.S., one of the ways that you control population in a prison or in a detention center is by keeping it very cold. It's a way that you kind of lower tensions in a way, but you're controlling the population in the facility, which leads me to the next one about euphemisms and the comments that you've made now in detention center versus prison. And here in the U.S., you have some facilities. My favorite is in a place called Lumpkin, Georgia, that the state of Georgia has a prison that it's rented or given or sold or whatever to Corrections Corporation of America, which changed its name to Core Civic. But my joke was, if it wasn't good enough for the state of Georgia, but it's good enough to hold immigration detainees. But literally, it's a prison, but now they no longer call it a prison. It's a detention facility. And so it's interesting that multiple countries do this. Understanding, and this leads to, in part, to the next answer, kind of a comment, leads to the answer to what Jose Miguel was asking, that one of the problems that happens is that there are little steps, little mechanical steps or little standards that are used to block people. So the excuse that sometimes is used, and I blame significantly, and my colleagues in human rights know my feelings quite well, because there isn't a conference where I don't say it, where human rights reporters cannot excuse governments. The constant excuse of the alleged poverty of a government to be able to not control persecutors or torturers or the mistreatment, and like I represent a lot of people who are severely mentally ill, and there's always the excuse, oh, we would if we could, or people who are LGBT, oh, we would if we could, or women who are victims of domestic violence, oh, we would if we could. But the oh, we would if we could excuse is too many times sort of, oh, it's a poor country. And that's nonsense. That's just nonsense. And we cannot excuse any country, because on the other side, the US immigration system, what it does is that if a government is trying, but it's not, if they can reduce it to general conditions of violence, if they can reduce it to poverty, if they can reduce it to criminality. If you think of the gangs, and the gangs are basically multinational political organizations that are in some instances in charge of certain local systems. But the US government will not accept that. The US government, if it should, they are what they are, they're terrorist organizations. And the answer is, why not accept it? Because if you do, then there's a political function to that rather than a criminal function. And so instances like this, or little steps like this, are used to one of my favorite absurdities is that even though you're essentially socially branded when you're a victim of a certain crime, we'll say rape. Well, there's one of the legalistic ideas is, well, the damage you suffered, the crime you suffered, cannot be used as a characteristic to justify your being a member of a particular social group, which is one of the categories that would give you protection. So then it's reduced to, oh no, it's just individual criminal activity. And even though socially it makes you a cognizably more vulnerable person within X society, no, we won't do that. And so tools like this are used for certain populations. And as to Jose Miguel's issue, one of the important things is that we have to remember that only in the 1960s did the Western Hemisphere quota get changed. We have to remember that there was always restrictionist immigration from, we'll call it the global south or call it the Western Hemisphere south of the border. But then even the Refugee Act of 1980, there weren't regulations implementing it until 1990. And even then, we're all equal, some more than others. Well, the issue is there are people who go, well, the definition of refugees, why don't we bring everybody in as a refugee? And the answer is, well, the definition is actually very restrictive, but you'll find in some instances that it's generally applied more generously. In other words, it's more flexible given circumstances and given who the applicants are. So that people from Africa, people from parts of Asia, people from South America or Latin America are held to a different standard than people. And I mean, arguably, I'll give you an example. All Ukrainians in Ukraine are arguably possible refugees within the definition of refugee, because they are in all, the Russian military is something the Ukrainian government cannot control. So a refugee is someone who is a victim of persecution or would be reasonably a victim of persecution on the part of the government, someone the government controls, someone the government cannot control because of their race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or particular social group. In other words, immutable characteristics that you cannot change or should not have to change, but that they have to be cognizable within the society. Ukrainians in the Ukraine are arguably all potential refugees, right? The issue is that, bring it back to El Salvador and to Guatemala, constantly, you had the use of the concept of general violence. And general violence is, you had people, one of my horrible cases, I remember, was a family that there was a battle between the Salvadoran army and the FMLN on their farm. Several family members died, and the decision was, this is tragic, but they are collateral damage. They were not targeted because of their opinion or because of their characteristics. It's just, and the answer was, if they were from somewhere else, would they have been treated differently? And the answer is more than likely yes. And so the issue is not just the law. And one of the things that I hope with films like yours that raise consciousness is that I really hope that immigrants in the diaspora really understand that it's possible to change the laws. It's possible to get judges who interpret the law fairly. But if you are indifferent, and sadly, it's the same thing as remittances. Remittances for consumer products, yes. Remittances for building society, no. And the answer is, if we don't work together, if we don't work, pardon the word, collectively, we're not going to move forward. And it's important that messages like yours continue to be out there, because of what I mentioned earlier, that people forget US history, people forget history in El Salvador, in Guatemala, in Honduras, in Nicaragua, in Mexico. Mexico to this day persecutes. We know the populations that are persecuted, and yet you have governments controlling the message, and human rights organizations, and understanding that different human rights organizations have different priorities, prisoners of conscience, or whatever is in fashion at the moment. But honestly, we need to hold governments accountable and say, no, this is not right. You can call the gentleman who, quite an amazing person, you can tell, the one who brought up the point of the euphemisms. It's like, yes, in your face, you can call it what you will. It's a prison. By the way, you don't get invited to meetings with the government when you say, oh, this is a prison. I can tell you. I don't know if I answered Jose Miguel's question.
Any follow-up comment, Sonia?
Perhaps to build a little on what Juan Carlos said about consciousness raising, I think I would like to add a little bit about what we hope to achieve with this documentary and where we see it going. So of course, raising the visibility of the issues is important. We wanted to talk specifically about forced migration and get away from this idea that that there are refugees and asylum seekers and internally displaced persons who might be seen as worthier of assistance and protection versus voluntary or economic migrants who, as Donald Trump once said, are just poor people, and the United States can't help all the poor people, so let's deport them back to their countries of origin. But really, what the film wants to do is, on the one hand, make this more visible, show why there are people who feel that there is no alternative to migration, but also to show how countries that sometimes have played a role in the instability that exists in the countries of origin, for example, in the Central American countries, how these countries then react when people who are fleeing come knocking on their doors, right? What are the strategies that get implemented just to keep out migrants who are not wanted? But this really leads us to what we might do with this documentary. Of course, when we talk about the problems that exist in Central America, or the situation in Mexico, a question that always comes up is what now? What can be done? So we have analyzed the problems that exist, but people want to know, of course, what can be done. And I would say that in the film, but also speaking more generally, I would like to get away a little from specific policy recommendations, not because they aren't necessary, but because I feel there is already research evidence out there on the situation in Central America, on the militarization of security in Mexico. There's also evidence on US migration and border policies, or on asylum procedures in the United States. All this has been documented already, but I think for me, it is perhaps my frustration with the little change that is happening that led me to consider a film such as this one. So rather than just add more specific policy measures for Central America or for Mexico or for the United States, really what I would like people to do with this film is to reflect on what they're seeing and to discuss it rather than talking to policymakers. I see this as a film that can speak to citizens who should take an interest in the world around them, and who I would like to realize that they themselves have a role to play in building this world. And also the reason for ending with Todd Miller was really because we wanted to put this out there as a reflection. Todd Miller himself said, well, perhaps people might think that this is a utopia. We will never get away from borders. This is just the way the world works. But I would say that if we don't try to imagine a different world, if we don't talk about structural transformations that are needed, if we don't contemplate different ways of relating to other human beings, this world will never come into existence. So I think the film can serve for reflection, but it can also be an opportunity for greater civic engagement. I think citizens should not simply expect governments or state institutions to do something for them, but the change that we would all like to see will not come about if citizens don't demand it. So I would, with this film, I would really like to stir something in people. I would like people to take something away from it and to ask themselves what they can do. And in that sense, the decision to include the Habesha project that you saw in the Mexican city of Aguascalientes was an example that can also get people to think a little bit about what I just said. The Habesha project is a small local initiative. They try to create higher education opportunities for refugees, and of course, what they can do is very limited in the face of the magnitude of the displacement that exists in the world. But this is an example of Mexican citizens. There are also immigrants working for this group now, but it started as a group of Mexican citizens who decided that the Mexican government did not do enough for refugees, and they did not. They decided not to spend their time on direct advocacy, but to get involved in their own initiative. And again, one might say, well, perhaps they're doing the work that the Mexican government should be doing in terms of providing really responses to the refugees that are out there. But this is just one example of citizens who are decided to get involved. And of course, this is just one example. But what I would like to leave as a message is that I think it's up to all of us to take an interest in the world and in the situation of other human beings. What we're seeing, forced migration, the inequalities that exist in the world are not far away problems. They also concern us in transit countries and in destination countries, and we also, in some way, may even be playing a role in the inequalities that exist in the global south. So I think we cannot simply say these are distant problems. They have nothing to do with our lives, but I think we should try to find out more about what is happening to the forced migrants out there, and try to see what we can do, either through perhaps social media campaigns or pressuring legislators or the government to really to respond differently to forced migrants.
We have less than 4 minutes or 4 minutes and a half. My final question would be, do you foresee any change in the United States administration policy towards immigration in the near future?
When it comes to expectations of change, I'm afraid I'm rather pessimistic. But I also have to say, even before Joe Biden became president, I was not very optimistic about his administration's policies. I did not expect deep changes to begin with, and I think what we're seeing now reminds us that there may be intentions. Governments maybe may want to implement different policies in ideal world, but we don't live in ideal world really. When we think about the implementation of policies, we find all sorts of obstacles, not just related to resource limitations, perhaps also to institutional habits that have developed over time, but often it is political and electoral considerations that also influence policies. So I would think that in the near future we cannot expect a change of direction in policies. But again, I would say this shouldn't be seen in a deterministic manner. If we just close the door to policy change, then probably there will be no policy change. Again, this links to my previous comment. We need to keep working on changes. We need to pressure for things to change, because if we don't, then things are certainly not going to change. So while I'm not optimistic about changes with this administration, either domestically or towards Mexico or Central America, I think that the challenge is to put our voices out there and to speak about the situation of migrants.
In doing that, where can we promote your film?
Thank you. That's an important question. I think generally it would be great if the documentary would find audiences at universities, schools, perhaps even community centers. We have created a microsite where the documentary is accessible, actually free of charge, because we consider it an educational tool. At the moment, I'm also trying to promote it at film festivals, so the public promotion is a little bit more limited, because I would like to see what we can achieve at film festivals in order to shine a greater light on this film. But of course, the documentary is already out there, and it would be great at universities, especially perhaps in the United States, if the documentary could be shown. Actually, the work of Juan Carlos also reminds me that there could be an audience also in the legal community. Legal aid clinics perhaps might find the film also interesting. So we've just really just finished the documentary. We've had some virtual presentations already, but we're still in the early stages of the promotion.
So the microsite is available already, or you want to?
It's available already.
And where is that?
I can send you the link, but it's really on the if you Google Proyecto Habesha, the organization that was featured also in the film. Since Habesha collaborated really in the making of this film, they were so generous as to create a microsite on their own website. So if you look up the Habesha project, Proyecto Habesha, you will find it in the menu.
Very good. Any final comment, Juan Carlos?
I'm concerned about the causes. I don't see much hope in the causes immediately, and anticipate in May. It's already been announced by the Biden administration that a new mechanism will be used for processing claims for asylum, starting in May, basically, on an expedited removal basis, where asylum officers will be quickly deciding these cases. And they're planning on hiring hundreds, if not thousands, of asylum applicants. And so one of the things that happens is that fast justice is not always justice, because most people can't get legal assistance, and most people have no idea what they're supposed to be raising. And so a lot of people who should be protected, who must be protected, will not be, whereas others might. But I don't see, I'm not optimistic in terms of overall changes in policy, because sadly, while I think that some uses of social media and such are important, one of the things that happens is that we end up with chatter. And once you get to those heroes that you showed at those shelters, those face reality on a daily basis, whereas others sort of delete their little emails or their posts, and they don't do anything. They don't even show up to vote sometimes. And so I'm hoping that I'm proven wrong, and that they do change, and that they start taking action, and that they actually, I saw in the people at these shelters and these advocates, as people who see the humanity of others and the importance of doing that and not just otherizing others or being xenophobic, if you will, but otherizing it would be let's just say broader. Thank you for including me and inviting me.
Oh, thank you, Juan Carlos, for your comment. Thank you, Sonia. It's a great film. We wish you luck in the film festivals, which are excellent for promoting the film. We will do whatever we can in promoting the vertical border in associations that we participate in. Perhaps the National Association of Hispanic Journalists, they have their assembly in August. If you want, I can promote that with them so that we have a presentation during our event in Las Vegas in early August. So that's something that we can do. And also, whenever you say, promoting it through Twitter and Instagram and all our social media pages. And with that, thank you to you both. And I'll give the microphone to Jose Miguel. Thank you, Jose Miguel, for the invitation. And was an excellent conference, as always, high level. And thank you very much.
Gracias, Alejandro. Thank you, Alejandro. I want to thank you for moderating this discussion. Also to Juan Carlos Gómez, who always says yes to us and participating in all these events, and obviously also to Sonia Wolf for allowing us to showcase her film, her important film. When I talked to Sonia some weeks ago about the possibility to have this film, she said something that resonated to me, and she said something like, well, you know, we spend our lives writing academic papers on these issues, right? And that's what we academics do, right? We write these papers, and few people read those papers, right? I mean, sometimes nobody reads those papers, and they have almost zero impact on anything, on policy. So that's why she decided to make this film, which really summarizes so many things of the complex phenomenon around migration, around refugees and human rights. So I take that also, that with that spirit, that was the spirit of this conference, that 1.5 day conference. I mean, to provide a space to talk, to speak about these important issues, right? From the taking into consideration very much the human perspective, the people's perspective of the suffering in migration. So that was the whole spirit of the conference that we started today, and the film basically is a great closing for all this effort. So thank you all of you. I want to take this moment also to thank all the panelists that participated yesterday, the people who attended. This is an initiative that we expect to do every year with a hemispheric view here from LACC. So this is our first year doing this. We're going to continue doing this year after year, expanding and trying to bring more voices for this discussion, and to get a little bit closer to the ears of the people who take decisions. We hope that at some point somebody will listen. So thank you all. I want also to take this opportunity to thank my colleagues here at LACC, the staff, President Solis, for supporting this effort from the very beginning. Obviously, to Lindsay Dudley, who has worked tirelessly to do this, along also with Lourdes Sosa FIU and the general staff in LACC, and thank you all for this, for all this support and for the possibility to do this. And again, thank you, Sonja, Juan Carlos, Alejandro, for a great discussion. So this concludes our conference. And with that, I'll see you soon, everybody. So thank you all. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.